I was scared. I couldn't whip Reuben. He was too big for me. I started to turn and leave when I thought of what my grandfather had told him. "You better remember what my grandpa said," I reminded him. "He'll do just what he said he would." Reuben didn't hit me. He just grabbed me with his brute strength, threw me down on the ground, He had me on my back with my arms outspread. He had a knee on each arm. I made no effort to fight back. I was scared. "If you say one word to your grandpa about this," Reuben said, "I'll catch you hunting some night and take my nap to you." Looking up into his ugly face, I knew he would do just what he said. I told him to let me up and I would go and not say anything to anyone. "Don't let him up, Reuben," Rainey said. "Beat the hell out of him or hold him and let me do it." Just then I heard growling and a commotion off to one side. The blue hound had finally gotten a fight out of old Dan. Turning my head sideways, I could see them standing on their hind legs, tearing and slashing at each other. The weight of the big hound pushed old Dan over. I told Reuben to let me up so we could stop the fight. He laughed. "While my dog is whipping yours, I think I'll just work you over a little." So saying, he jerked my cap off and started whipping me in the face with it. I heard Rainey yell, "Reuben, they're killing old Blue!" Reuben jumped off me. I clambered up and looked over to the fight. What I saw thrilled me. Faithful little Ann, bitch though she was, had gone to the assistance of old Dan. I knew my dogs were very close to each other. Everything they did was a combination, but I never expected this. It is a very rare occasion for a bitch dog to fight another dog. But fight she did. I could see that little Anne's jaws were glued to the throat of the big hound. She could never loosen that deadly hold until the last breath of life was gone. Old Dan was tearing and slashing at the soft belly. I knew the destruction his long, sharp teeth were causing. Again, Rainey yelled, "Reuben, they're killing him! They're killing old Blue! Do something quick! Reuben darted over to one side, grabbed my axe from the ground, and said in a loud voice, "I'll kill them damn hounds!" At the thought of what he was going to do with the axe, I screamed and ran for my dogs. Reuben was about 10 feet ahead of me, bent over, running with the axe held out in front of him. I knew I would never get to them in time. I was screaming, "No, Reuben, no!" I saw the small stick when it whipped up from the ground. As if it were alive, it caught between Reuben's legs. I saw him fall. I ran on by. Reaching the dogfight, I saw the big hound was almost gone. He had long since ceased fighting. His body lay stretched full length on the ground. I grabbed old Dan's collar and pulled him back. It was different with little Anne. Pull as I might, she wouldn't let go of the hound's throat. Her jaws were locked. I turned old Dan loose and, getting the straddle of little Anne, I pried at her jaws apart with my hands. Old Dan had started back in. Grabbing his collar again, I pulled them off to one side. The blue hound lay where he was. I thought perhaps he was already dead, and then I saw him move a little. Still holding my dogs by their collars, I looked back. I couldn't understand what I saw. Reuben was where he had fallen. His body was towards me, and his body was bent in a U. His back was towards me, and his body was bent in a U shape. Rainey was standing on the other side of him, staring down. I hollered and asked Rainey, "What's the matter?" He didn't answer. He just looked as though in a trance, staring down at Reuben. I hollered again. He still didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't turn my dogs loose. They would go for the hound again. Again I hollered at Rainey, asking him to come and help me. He neither moved nor answered. I had to do something. Looking around, my glance fell on the old barbed wire fence. I let my dogs to it. Holding onto their collars with one hand, I worked a rusty barbed wire backwards and forwards against a staple until it broke. Running the end of it under their collars, I tied them up. They made 2 or 3 lunges toward the hound, but the wire held. I walked over and stopped at Rainey's side. I again asked, "What's the matter?" He said not a word. I could see that Rainey was paralyzed with fright. His mouth and eyes were opened wide, and his face was as white as chalk. I laid my hand on his shoulder. At the touch of my hand, he jumped and screamed. Still screaming, he turned and started running. I watched him until he disappeared in the darkness. Looking down at Reuben, I saw what had paralyzed Rainey. When Reuben had tripped, he had fallen on the axe. This is extremely graphic. As it entered his stomach. The sharp blade had sunk to the eye of the double-bitted axe. Turning my back to the horrible sight, I closed my eyes. The muscles in my stomach knotted and jerked. A nauseating sickness spread over my body. I couldn't look at him. I heard Reuben whisper. Turning around, I knelt down by my side with my back to the axe. I couldn't understand what he was saying. Kneeling down closer, I heard and understood. In a faint voice, he said, "Take it out of me." I hesitated. Again he pleaded, "Please take it out of me." Turning around, I saw his hands were curled around the protruding blade as if he himself had tried to pull it from his stomach. How I did it, I'll never know. Putting my hands over his and pressing down, I pulled the axe from the wound. The blood gushed. I felt the warm heat as it spread over my hands. Again the sickness came over me. I stumbled to my feet and stepped back a few paces. Seeing a movement from Reuben, I thought he was going to get up. With his hands, he pushed himself halfway up. His eyes were wide open, staring straight at me. Stopping in his effort of getting up, still staring at me, his mouth opened as if to say something. Words never came. Instead, a large red bubble slowly worked its way out of his mouth and burst. He fell back to the ground. I knew he was dead. Scared, not knowing what to do, I called for Rainey. I got no answer. I called his name again and again. I could get no reply. My voice echoed in the darkness of the silent night. A cold chill ran over my body. I suppose it is natural at a time like that for a boy to think of his mother. I thought of mine. I wanted to get home. Going over to my dogs, I glanced to where the blue hound was. He was trying to get up. I was glad he wasn't dead. Picking up my lantern, I thought of my axe. I left it. I didn't care if I never saw it again. Knowing I couldn't turn my dogs loose, I broke off enough of the wire to lead them. As I passed under the branches of the bur oak tree, I looked up to the dark foliage. I could see the bright eyes of the ghost coon. Everything that had happened on this terrible night was because of his very existence. But it wasn't his fault. I also knew he was a silent witness to the horrible scene. Behind me lay the still body of a young boy. On my left, a blue tick-hound lay torn and bleeding. Even after all that had happened, I could feel no hatred for the ghost coon and was not sorry I had let him live. Arriving home, I awakened my mother and father. Starting at my grandfather's mill, I told everything that had happened. I left nothing out. My mother had started crying long before I had completed my story. Papa said nothing, just sat and listened. When I had finished, he kept staring down at the floor in deep thought. I could hear the sobbing of my mother in the silence. I walked over to her. She put her arms around me and said, "My poor little boy." Getting to his feet, Papa reached for his coat and hat. Mama asked him where he was going. Well, I have to go up there," he said. "I'm going to get Grandpa, for he's the only man in the country that has authority to move the body." Looking at me, he said, "You go across the river and get old man Lowry, and you may as well go up and tell the Bufords, too. Tell them to meet us at your grandfather's place." I hurried to carry the sad message. The following day was a nasty one. A slow, cold drizzle had set in. Feeling trapped indoors, I prowled from room to room. I couldn't understand why my father hadn't come back from the Pritchards. I sat by the window and watched the road. Understanding my feelings, Mama said, "Billy, I wouldn't worry. He'll be back before long. It takes time for things like that." "I know," I said, "but you would think he would have been back by now." Time dragged slowly by. Late in the afternoon, I saw Papa coming. Our old mule was jogging along. Water was shooting out from under his feet in small squirts at every step. Papa tied the halter rope around the mule's neck. He was sitting humped over, with his hands jammed deep in the pockets of his patched and worn mackinsaw. I felt sorry for him. He was soaking wet, tired, sleepy, and hungry. Telling Mama, "Here he is," I grabbed my jumper and cap and ran out to the gate and waited. I was going to ask him what had happened to the Pritchards, but on seeing his tired face and wet clothes, I said, "Papa, you'd better go into the fire. I'll take care of the mule, and you do the feeding and milking." "That would be fine," he said. After doing the chores, I hurried to the house. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find out what had happened. Walking into the front room, I saw my father had changed clothes. He was standing in front of the fireplace, drinking coffee. "Boy, that's bad weather, isn't it?" he said. I said it was. I asked him about Reuben. "We went to the old tree and got Reuben's body," Pop said. "We were on our way back to the Pritchards when we met them. They were just this side of their place. They had started to look for him. Rainey had been so dazed when he got home they couldn't make out what he was trying to tell them, but they knew it must have been something bad. They wanted to know what had happened. I did my best to explain the accident. It hit old man Pritchard pretty hard. I felt sorry for him." Mama asked how Mrs. Pritchard was taking it. Papa said he didn't know, as he never did get to see any of the women folks. He said they were the funniest bunch he had ever seen. He couldn't understand them. There wasn't one tear shed that he could see. All the men stayed out of the barn. They never had been invited in for a cup of coffee or anything. Mama asked when they were to have the funeral. "They have their own graveyard right there on the place," Papa said. "Old man Pritchard said they would take care of everything and didn't want to bother people. He said it was too far for anyone to come, and it was bad weather, too." Mama said she couldn't help feeling sorry for Mrs. Pritchard and wished they were more friendly. I asked Papa about Rainey. Papa said, according to what old man Pritchard said, Rainey just couldn't seem to get over the shock. They were figuring on taking him down to see the doctor. In a stern voice, Papa said, "Billy, I don't want you fooling around with the Pritchards anymore. You have plenty of country around here, so you don't have to go there to hunt." I said I wouldn't. I felt bad about the death of Reuben. I didn't feel like hunting and kept having bad dreams. I couldn't forget the way he looked at me just before he died. I moped and wandered around in a daze. I wanted to do something, but didn't know what it was. I explained my feelings to my mother. She said, "Billy, I feel the same way, and I would like to do something to help, but I guess there's nothing we can do. There are people like the Pritchards all through the hills. They live in little worlds of their own and are all alone. They don't like to have outsiders interfere." I told my mother I had been thinking about how dangerous it was to carry an axe while hunting, and I had decided I'd save a few coon hides and get a good gun. Boy, I just shouldn't have mentioned getting a gun. My mother got sitting hen mad. "You're not getting a gun," she said. "I won't have that at all. I told you a long time ago you could have one when you were 21 years old, and I mean just that. I worry enough with you out there in the hills all hours of the night